even those painful experiences have a freshness or a rawness to them that can be the gateway to a kind of clarity, even more so than pleasant experiences. Sometimes we can use any of those things. If you can use even something as sorrowful as the loss of a loved one as a sort of entrance into a new perspective or a new way of seeing, that's what we call Zen training.
You're listening to Find the Good News, Episode 92, The Resonant Strings, a Beacon Series conversation featuring Meido Moore Roshi, abbot of Korinji, a Rinzai Zen monastery, and author of the Rinzai Zen Way, a guide to practice, from Shambala Publications. Find the Good News is produced by Parker Brand Creative Services, a branding agency that thinks sideways, pushes forward, and gets your brand up. See what else we do at parkerbrandup.com. Zen. In the circles I've traveled, it is a word that is often said and even more misunderstood. Truth? I'm still trying to understand it myself. More truth? When I feel I've built a nice and sturdy framework for it, the structure I've constructed topples to sticks and stones. I laugh about it, I cry about it, I let go, I start again. This, I think, is Zen. But is it? It's this question that lies at the heart of my conversation with Meido Moore Roshi, abbot of Korinji, a Rinzai Zen monastery in Wisconsin, where he transmits Zen Buddhist teachings that can find roots as far back as 5th century India. Meido is an 86th generation Zen Dharma heir and a 48th generation holder of the lineage descended from Rinzai Gaijin. The Rinzai Zen Way, as instructed by Meido Moore Roshi, places particular emphasis on making use of the body as part of the practice, as well as fine arts and internal energetic work. It was clear to me that he has an elemental connection and appreciation for the natural world, sharing this with his students by incorporating earth, air, fire, and water into their training. While there is certainly an aesthetic to Zen that is quite peaceful and minimalist, Meido is clear that the Rinzai Zen Way is much more akin to boot camp than a day at the spa. In this conversation, Meido graciously helped clarify many of the concepts of Zen Buddhism, not least of all these three. What am I? What is this life for? And why is there suffering? Tucked in the green hills and farmlands of Madison, Wisconsin, there is, at this very moment, an abbot and his students sincerely seeking the answers to these very questions. Wisdom and compassion are cultivated, the wheel of the Dharma turns, transmission occurs. I am reminded that it is good to have obtained this human existence. This, I think, is Zen. Now, it's time to tune your attention to this good news beacon and press play on a little good news.
Wake up this morning, dreaming up a story. I can hear the way it's going, 'cause you're laughing in your sleep. On the path to your deliverance in a holy wall of light. Pouring through your window.
Old news, bad news, fake news. Sometimes you want to shut those signals down and seek a better source. With my Find the Good News Beacon series, I tune into good people doing good works wherever I can find them. I scan across the full spectrum of life, seeking out human beings that have turned their dials towards helping others, aligning their time, resources, and talents with goodness, justice, mercy, and love. In each episode, I sync up with the hearts and minds of my extraordinary guests. We have dynamic conversations that invigorate the mind long after our transmission has ended. I discover the critical life experiences that shape them, the perspectives that drive them, and the fundamental beliefs that have anchored them to a path of goodness. There's a lot of background noise in the world. My name is Orrin Parker, and I'm cutting through the static to find the good.
I love you just as well.
And I believe the little bridge that got me in front of you and you in front of me was Greg Soden from the Classical Ideas podcast.
Yeah, that's right. Great guy and great podcast.
Yeah, I love his show. That was one of those kind of serendipitous things, you know, you listen to someone's show and you consume things like that, and then one day, you just go, well, why don't I just reach out to this guy? He's up at the top of the country. I'm down here at the bottom. He doesn't know me, but maybe we can build a little bridge. And yeah, he's become a really good friend. An ally, I guess, so to speak. I think he's doing good work with that show.
Oh yeah, great work. And I've noticed that he's become kind of a networker for folks, which is a nice side benefit. Yeah.
Yeah, really. That's true. That's what it's very close to what I told him. I said, you're kind of building bridges between cultures and communities and religions and getting people to have conversations that I think are hugely important. I mean, I'm in Louisiana, and the truth of the matter is I think we desperately need more conversations like that down here. I mean, we need them everywhere, but so that's partly why I'm talking to you today, actually, just to bring
fantastic.
Is to bring that to the people here who listen to me, but also to my listeners all over the place. But so just for a quick minute, if you could, I know you've probably been asked this question a countless number of times, if you could give a little rundown of who I'm talking to today for the listeners, so I don't screw it up.
Sure. My name is Meido Moore, and I'm a Zen Buddhist priest, and I serve as the abbot of Korinji, which is a monastery in the Rinzai Zen lineage. We're located in Wisconsin. That's my main activity and what I do full time. And we have a few folks up here doing traditional monastic training in the 1,000-year-old Rinzai Zen style in the middle of the Wisconsin forest of all places. So it's quite amazing.
It's a beautiful place. I follow you on Facebook, and so you post a regular stream of images, and I can't lie, it's fascinating to me. I mean, I want to put myself there, whenever I see.
Well, I'm trying to hook everybody I can. That's my bait.
Yeah. It's funny because I listened to another interview with you, and the person interviewing you had said something like, how do you pitch the monastery to people, or are you doing that? And you said, I'm actually trying to discourage people, and you laughed, and I was like, I would love to hear more about what you mean by that, because I kind of felt like I knew what you meant, but I thought that would be a kind of fun place to start.
Oh, sure. I mean, in one sense, I want to encourage people, and social media, things like Facebook and podcasts like yours have been fantastic for letting people know we exist and giving them a sense of what we're doing here. But people who are attracted to this kind of practice are attracted for the right reasons, but oftentimes do not have a sense of what it really entails and how rigorous it is. And it is really an exhaustive, difficult kind of training. That being said, the rewards or the benefits of it are immense. But I guess I want to encourage people to explore it, to explore Zen and Buddhism and this kind of deeply embodied meditation practice that we do. But then if someone says, I'm interested to come to the monastery, the first thing I have to do is pop most of their illusions about what that is. Right. And, I think a lot of people think that it's this kind of place must be a very calm, deeply spiritual, relaxing sort of retreat. And it's not that. It's, we're deeply spiritual in a way, but it's a place where you're brought to the extremes of facing yourself and seeing what's inside your own mind and how to function with your own body, mind in the most efficient way. It's very, very, very rigorous, intense training. I think it's more akin to, boot camp than it is to a relaxing resort vacation.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing we need to let people know. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that actually leads right into something that I kept thinking about as I was reading your book. And it's something that, maybe the word bother isn't right, but it's something that's sort of pinged in my brain over and over throughout the years. And it's when somebody typically, and I would say Western culture especially, when someone uses the word Zen, I almost have to stop right there and go, I need to know what you're talking about when you say that word before we can go any further. Because for a lot of folks, it means, a white room with a simple pedestal and a one single vase with a flower in it, and that's Zen. And in a sense, it's more an aesthetic to a lot of people, as I've discovered. And they'll call things, oh, that's very Zen. And what you just described kind of cuts through that, right? I mean, you said, oh, this is more like, in a serious way, like akin to boot camp.
Yeah, Zen culture or Zen art are aspects of what are really Japanese culture primarily, or aspects of Chinese culture like Chinese ink painting and so on, that are very attractive to people, have been labeled with the term Zen. And there's some truth to that, in that Zen has been a tremendous influence on East Asian aesthetic culture. But when we're talking about Zen Buddhism as a practice, as a spiritual discipline of body and mind, or what is essentially a yogic discipline. So the yogic, what I call the yogic branch of spirituality, which is not primarily faith-based, or not primarily based on theology, but based on deep exploration of mind and body through various practices. It's an exhaustive process, and there's nothing sometimes calm and pleasant about facing oneself in the mirror of practice. We get to drill down into our own minds using meditation and other embodied disciplines, and see exactly how depraved we all are.
Right.
And that's the starting point of our training, is to see that it's not always so relaxed and calm, but again, it's very profound practice, and I think the end result of it is a very balanced, compassionate, clear human being. That's our ideal. But yeah, certainly much more than an austere vase in a white room. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, it's like the trappings of it. That's one thing I've always been fascinated by, is and almost where I live, to be honest with you, there's not a lot of exposure to any Buddhist teachings. There are no Dharma centers. We're in a predominantly 50-50 mix between Catholic culture and Protestant Christianity. So, the exposure is just not there. So when Zen is mentioned, it's only in very, very small pockets of, I guess the word would be enthusiasts, maybe, because, I don't know personally any true practitioners, I guess, that are really committed on the level that you and people at your monastery obviously are. So yeah, it's interesting. In fact, as I was reading your book, I had to rewind a little bit in my mind and go back in time, because I was thinking back to, well, hold on, I'm going to put a pin right there and explain this a little better. So I had an experience in my 20s, and it was sort of like looking back on it, I would almost say it was like what you described. It was a really hard look in the mirror, but it happened very rapidly. I saw my ugliness, I would say, my demons, really quickly. And in that really quick time period, there was like this one day of almost like a sudden flash of clarity, almost like realization, where I could see it all. And it really changed my life. I didn't know what it was, didn't even know how to label that. So I went on this sort of search in the wild, so to speak, through religions and cultures, trying to understand. And so Buddhism ultimately came into came in front of me and on that journey, and Zen as well, as in a particular path. But so I found language in there that I was really fascinated by. But your book, as I was reading it, I kept thinking, man, this was the book right here, because especially the first half. I was like, this is, because I highlight, like anybody, you highlight and you make notes as you stumble upon things that are of particular interest. But what I started noticing in your book was that I'd practically highlighted most of the book, because I was like, okay, I might as well not have highlighted anything at all, because it's so rich in that regard. You outline things so well and clear, and you cover all of these things that I felt like I had to stumble upon collectively over the years. So I want to just say, in my opinion, as however humble that may be, I appreciate a work like that. And I think of I was thinking about our talk today, and I thought, man, how different things are. Maybe there's a 20-year-old young man or woman out there who will listen to this conversation and go, I'm at that point and I'm looking for guidance, and like me, they don't have proximity to a teacher, and life circumstances don't put that in front of you. I'm hoping that they will stumble upon this and then stumble upon your work, honestly.
Oh, that's very gracious. And to think that the book could do that for someone really leaves me feeling gratified, because I think, like many people who write something, I ended up writing the kind of book that I wish I had had.
Yeah.
And I don't always assume that means it's going to be useful to others too, but I sincerely hope it is. Yeah. And, you mentioned enthusiasts. A lot of folks who are interested in Zen are really just on that level of being an enthusiast, but that's how we start. And even how Zen started here in the States with the beat writers, Kerouac and so on, some of whom went on to become serious practitioners, but initially we would just call them enthusiasts, but they really laid the foundation of something that was an alternative view or exposure to a different tradition from the mainstream. So I would encourage anyone listening, of course, if the book is helpful, that's great, but your enthusiasm or initial interest, even if later on we might consider it a little shallow, that's how we all started. That's the gate. And just start exploring, man. Get out there and read and be voracious and travel and meet teachers. And that's how we all did it.
Yeah, see, that's what I should have done, I guess. In hindsight, we all have that, I guess. And I should have traveled more in my youth. But we all take these paths that we do, and you make sometimes poor decisions with limited information. And so you get on a track. And that was one thing that I always found interesting, was how easily you can get on a track and then truck along and not realize that you're on it, or that you're really being pushed by a momentum that's it's almost habit energy, and then you look back and a lot of years go by, and it's like, well, how did this happen? How did I get so far down this track? And I find that, like Zen, it can kind of break that in a way. And it's a lot like what you described about it being a boot camp. Like when I think of Zen now, I think of it as something that almost crashes through. In almost sometimes a messy way, even. Like, it's like, okay, there's actually a great crashing that needs to happen and needs to cut through all of this, this and that. I think about I call it the curse of this and that. It's like, in your book, you kind of get into a lot of that territory about the dualism. Seeing one thing as separate, and then I am separate, and how that begins sort of this. For me, again, that track I got on, where I just was going forward, and it was all about the I-driven reality, and so how does practicing Zen, I mean, for the listeners who maybe this is their first foray into that world, how does Zen approach that? Because it is, to me, like a disease. In fact, you use the word medicine, I think, several times in your book, and I loved that it was like a medicine or a balm.
Yeah, that's an old Buddhist expression. I mean, the Buddha's words themselves, speak in that way, that the teachings are like a medicine for the disease of our own ignorance and delusion. The process can be messy or not messy. It really depends on the person. But the thing is, we all have messiness. I don't know anyone who does a deep self-exploration in any tradition. And I don't say Zen is the only path that's useful to people. I think of, you mentioned Catholic culture around you. I think of the Catholic contemplatives, like the Carmelites. I mean, those guys are doing very profound inner spiritual exploration. So any kind of tradition like that, there's going to be messiness. The techniques themselves can be very sharp and precise and razor-like in their application, but what you end up with is this open, bleeding body on the table, and it takes a while to get that stitched back together in a way. But I think anyone who encounters the Buddhist teachings about dualism or the sort of fact that our ideas of self are not quite as accurate as we think they are, anyone who encounters that and isn't a little frightened or a little put off by it probably didn't really grasp it very well. So in the beginning, we can talk about boot camp, but I guess what I want to say is in the beginning, there's also very approachable ways and there's gradual ways. And there's many, many tools in the Zen toolbox to help someone gradually approach the tradition and begin to sort of dissolve their own obstructions through practice that aren't all necessarily crashing through or dramatic or, the messiness can be all at once, or it can be a little bit at a time.
Yeah.
we have to find the approach that fits each person, if that makes sense.
No, it absolutely does. It's interesting. As I'm listening to you talk, sometimes when I'm listening or talking with the guests, I get these sort of visualizations in my mind, and listening to you describe that, it kind of reminds me of this beautiful heat lightning storm we had here a couple of years ago, and it was really something to see. And we turned all the lights off in our home so I could really go outside and see it. It was really dramatic, and I was filming out there because it was like for split seconds, lightning crash seconds, it was like dawn. You could see the entire neighborhood. It was almost like HD, and it reminds me sort of like what practice is like, or any kind of contemplative practice. It's like you get these flashes, at least for me, where all of a sudden everything, the good, the bad, the ugly, the beautiful, the glorious, it's all illuminated just for a split second. And if you can capture that. And I guess in a way that's kind of what I've almost been chasing. Maybe chasing's not the right word. Falling towards, like that kind of thing, where these moments like that, and when they hit, whether it be, looking at the birds feed on the bird feeder and being in that moment of time with them, or maybe in the pain or the sorrow of losing my father, it was very illuminated, even though it was painful. And yeah, that moment may have been a crashing through, but, you can also have that moment. And it's almost like the same thing to me, I guess, whenever you're looking at a rainbow, that it suddenly appears and it's very vivid. And that's the same kind of thing. I don't know if I'm even making any sense. I'm kind of rambling here in my own head, but
no, you're making great sense. I mean, even those painful experiences have a freshness or a rawness to them that can be the gateway to a kind of clarity, or can help us to experience our sort of own intrinsic clarity, even more so than pleasant experiences. Sometimes we can use any of those things. So if you can use even something as sorrowful as the loss of a loved one as a sort of entrance into a new perspective or a new way of seeing, that's what we call Zen training. We have many practices to help us do that, but essentially it's to use all the experiences of life, whether they're so-called good or bad, to help us revisit and remember, and then eventually to embody this intrinsic clarity which we have. Okay. And in that sense, it's not so mysterious. Yeah.
So, okay, that kind of visually, again, I'm thinking about some of the things I've seen on your Facebook page, some of the pictures, and I see you doing something that looks like waterfall training or some kind of waterfall meditation. And I mean, speaking of what we just talked about right there, experiencing the good and the bad, is there any element of that would relate to that type of training? Where I see...
Yeah, because it's unpleasant. Because it's bad, right?
Well, is it, though? I mean, that's kind of what I wondered about that. I kind of, I've tried to use these imagination exercises, and when I see these pictures, I go, okay, so what is this like, because, I meditate, and most of the time it's in a very comfortable environment, but I've also been in great pain physically, and so being with that pain to some degree, even though the pain hasn't changed, the perception of the pain sometimes changes. And I don't want to say the pain doesn't hurt, I don't want to sound like Jesse Ventura from Predator, but, pain don't hurt. But sometimes it doesn't when you're with it, I guess. And so it made me think of this waterfall, these images I've seen. I don't know. I was kind of fascinated by that. I was playing in my own head, trying to imagine what that's like. Obviously, I would love to hear from you, like some of the thoughts behind that.
That's in Japanese called takigyo, which literally means waterfall training. And it's actually not a Zen practice per se. It's more typically encountered in the tradition called shugendo, in which I am also ordained. But it's another Buddhist tradition coming out from Japanese culture, which happens to involve a lot of practices or austerities that are done in nature, like in a waterfall. And the interesting thing about that training, as I have experienced it, is that, standing under an icy cold waterfall is not something you would call pleasant or that most people would seek. Most people like the hot shower, right? But you stand under something icy like that, and even in winter we can do it, when the weather's not warm. But the moment the water impacts you, and there's a preparatory process and a ritual to enter the waterfall with a mantra and mudra and certain kind of breathing we can do and so on. But the minute the water hits you, the shock of the cold causes the usual sort of mental spinning, sort of discursive habit of the mind chattering to itself, and that dualistic fixation, that usual way of seeing, which is very self-referential and I-focused, and I'm inside here, the universe is out there, and so on. At that moment, the shock of the water causes all of that momentarily to collapse. The mind just it can't sustain it. It stops. And a moment later, it could, sort of click in again because of habit. But if you have the presence of mind, also through meditation practice, you have the clarity in that moment when the water hits to catch that moment of clearness. You can sustain it. You can remain in it. So the water itself becomes kind of a gateway to seeing in a more clear, more real, less self-fixated manner. And then, once the water hits you, you remain under the waterfalls for some period of time. You're chanting, you're using mantra as a means to focus and resonate the body with a particular vibration. So you start to, again, use the mind and body to change the way you experience. But the unique part of it, again, to me, is that shock, that first moment when the cold water hits you. I couldn't call it pleasant. Just like the pain of meditation you mentioned, it's not pleasant, but it's so raw and so real. And at that moment, the usual way of thinking, we get knocked out from our habit. That's the opportunity for insight to come.
That's fascinating. So
that's how you could, you could understand that practice maybe more deeply if you look at it that way.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, it kind of gets me thinking about it when we get stuck on this sort of cyclical things going on in our minds, or even just being on a track, as I said earlier, where you've dug these ruts and your wheels don't want to get off because you've just got these ruts that you keep driving through. And that practice, it seems like it just shocks you. It's almost like a big shove, to get you out of that.
Very much so.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah, and everything which I would consider myself, my memories, my story, my prejudices, my likes, my dislikes. That moment when the water hits, that stuff's not there. It's gone. There's just a clear awareness, and you can feel somehow through your body, you can feel all the way upstream to the end of the valley. You can feel all the way downstream to where the water goes. Even your perception of your bodily boundaries changes. So, from a Buddhist standpoint, it's a more clear, more real way of seeing. And the fact that we're standing under a waterfall is just the method, just the tool to get to that.
It kind of echoes of like Sweat Lodge almost to some degree. I mean, it kind of makes me get a little bit of that vibe, that's sort of similar in that regard. Am I off in saying that?
I don't think so. I think it's the same way to sort of experiment with the body and the mind to see how we can change our way of experiencing. And there's actually a practice not unlike that also in Shugendo. I can't really talk about the details, but not really a sweat lodge, but a situation like that where you go into an oppressive, sort of hot or difficult environment and you just stay with it and you relax into it. And some kind of realization can come from that. Yeah. Very interesting.
That is interesting.
I think you're right.
Yeah, maybe one of the things that was very different about this your book Rinzai Zen too was the physical aspect of it. I thought that was fascinating because that's something that again, with enthusiasm, you can tend to go, oh, I want to disconnect, right? Like that's almost like another of those novel Zen ideas that it gets sort of infused in the culture where it's like, oh, well, Zen is like disconnecting, it's checking out from the stress, and that may be part of it. That may be true, but I am not my body. I'm throwing out all the tropes, and so when I'm reading your book, you're like, oh no, the body is definitely a part of this. The body is hyper important.
Yeah, we talk about the body mind. It's not that they're not separate in a way, but they're also not separate. We have to use, or we can harness and use both of them. And I guess that in a nutshell defines what I call the yogic approach to spirituality. I think a lot of Western spirituality, because of our philosophical tradition and the directions that theology have gone, we do have this, again, talking about dualism, this real idea of matter and spirit being separate things, and one is not so pure, it's to be negated. One is to be sought, it's pure. That is a kind of theory which doesn't hold in the whole stream of spirituality of which Buddhism is a part. The body and matter and this world are precisely to be used and valued, and they're encompassed within the spirituality. They're a gateway to realization, not an obstacle to it, in a sense. So when we do meditation, we sit in a particular posture, we breathe a particular way, we have a way to use the mind, we use our senses in a particular manner. It's only because I have a body that I can do that practice.
Yeah,
That's
right.
the value of it. And then I could change my spiritual understanding and my way of experiencing things. And we believe even the direction of my existence in a lasting manner by means of the body. So to have a healthy body that you can do spiritual practice with, body is not a curse, it's a gift. It's an incredible opportunity. That's the perspective of our tradition.
And I'm happy, I know it. I'm helped.
I hate to pause the program, but I want to ask you something. Did you know that you can help me and my team at Parker Brand Creative Services grow the Find the Good News signal? For less than a fancy cup of coffee, you can become an Early Risers Club patron on our Patreon page. What's Patreon? Well, it's a way for creators to fund their projects by pooling support from those really passionate people that believe in what they're doing. Do you believe in what we're doing with Find the Good News? I hope you do. We believe that there's already enough negative news in the world, even right here at home, and that good people doing good works deserve a platform to speak from too. That's why we created Find the Good News, and we believe in that simple mission. Maybe you believe in it too. If you do believe in finding and sharing good news, then head over to our Patreon page right now or check out the link in the show description. For a commitment of $3.33 a month, you can join the Early Risers Club of Find the Good News Patreon supporters and get access to the B-Sides, a patrons-only podcast with the crew behind Find the Good News, Parker Brand Creative Services. Each time we level up, the Patreon rewards will get bigger. If you're tired of old news, bad news, and fake news, help support Find the Good News at patreon.com/findthegoodnews. That's patreon.com/findthegoodnews. Now, back to the episode.
I love you just as well.
One of the great treasures of my life was the sort of sideways and accidental way I first heard someone read Shantideva. And I remember hearing it. I didn't know what it was I was hearing, but I remember feeling like I was hearing the truth. That's the best way I could describe it. It was like a very clear resonance, like, oh, this is true. What I am hearing is true. And there was the one line that really sticks out, and it reminds me of what you're saying, was very short. Having well obtained this human existence, I have been born in the family of Buddha. And boy, everything you just said, I mean, sometimes we can forget that what a great treasure it is to be a human being, to have this body and this existence.
From the Buddhist standpoint, it's extraordinarily rare to be born, to come into existence in a place where the teachings exist with a healthy mind and body, and also to have the interest in the teachings, to have the opportunity to encounter them, all of those things, so rare as to be miraculous. So, someone like you encountered even the word Buddhism or the word Zen, just to hear that word in your existence means you're so incredibly fortunate.
Yeah.
You have very deep karmic roots.
You talked about that in your book, and I was sucked down that tunnel. I was like, I never really stopped to sit with that and think, what a blessing. I could have been born in the whole lineage of, and you and all of us, the whole line of your ancestors comes to this point, and you go, oh,
that's right.
Wow. In all of this blood and DNA and history and suffering and joy and pain. And then in this, it rises up in you and you get to, your book really clearly pointed that out. I don't want to, I'll go off on a whole tangent about it. Cause my mind was kind of lit up when I read that part. Cause I thought, what a treasure, it really is a treasure. And I can see why a teacher would want to share that treasure because you found a treasure. Yes. Is that accurate?
Oh yeah. I would never say that this tradition is for everybody. Everyone, if they have interest, it's for them. If they don't have interest, we would say that's their karma. But, it's available to them. But I could say for myself that it saved my life and, completely transformed the direction of my own life. I think without the training that I undertook, that I'd be a fairly useless, selfish, self-absorbed person. I still am those things to some degree, but I would be much more than I am. If I could share it in some small way, and as someone who has the title of teacher, I feel strongly that obligation to do so, obviously. That's the only way I could somehow begin to repay the debt I owe to my own teachers and to the lineage of the teachers through history. It will never be sufficient, but at least I could try to repay that a little bit.
Yeah. I was thinking about you. So I've been reading your book over the last month, in a comfortable pace. And I was thinking about you one morning. And of course, obviously I hadn't talked to you yet, but you put so much out in the book that it gives you so much to really chew on. And I go on these bike rides out in the country out here, and it's dandelion season. And as I noticed as I was riding, there would be these clusters of dandelions, on the side of the road or out in the field, but they would all be kind of clustered together. And then you would have this big gap. And then you'd see another little cluster, and they'd be, different size clusters. And so one day I went, and the ones that had went to seed, I go foraging in the woods for like wildflowers and stuff and find seed heads. So that one day I said, I've never really harvested dandelions because they're everywhere. Who was going to harvest dandelions? But as I was picking those heads up, it got me thinking about your monastery and the transmission of teaching. And I thought, sometimes... So these dandelions, one little dandelion seed could go 5, 6, 7 miles before it lands somewhere and takes root. And from that one little seed, you'll get these little clusters like that. And I thought of your monastery, and I thought of the transmission of teaching, and as you were outlining some of that in your book, and I thought this is very much like this, the way these dandelions cluster together, and sometimes you just have a wild seed. You don't know who's going to hear it, who's going to hear something that you've taught, and it's going to take root in them. That's a fascinating thing. And I don't know, I think that's a beauty, the treasure of a teaching. And in your position, I think it's almost like me harvesting those dandelion heads. You've got a monastery, and that's kind of what's happening. You're consciously planting them in a pot, so to speak. So they can all come up together. That's a beautiful thing.
There's the famous Zen master Dogen, who's the founder of the Soto school, not the Rinzai school, but the Soto school in Japan. I don't remember the exact quote, but he said upon one occasion that the merit, the blessing of starting a temple or a monastery was so great that even if it failed, even if you only were able to construct one pillar, it was still worth doing. So I've tried to keep those words in mind as we've gone through the difficult process of getting this place started. And, even if it shuts down next year, we have no idea we never know what's going to happen, but some seed someplace in the future could be useful, or even through this podcast, maybe that's what it's all for. I have to have that faith.
Yeah. That one thing that I guess I've hungered for, but have never experienced is that direct transmission of a teaching from a teacher. And you talk about the importance of that in Zen. And in fact, I think you said, and maybe all Zen teachings said this, that if there is no teacher, it can't be really called Zen. And so I wonder about these people out there in the world like me who are like displaced, like you go, okay, there are no within no reasonable proximity, there are no teachers. But yet you have an enthusiasm and an attraction to a teaching. What do you suggest for people like that? I mean, that you just can't pack up and go find a teacher. Is that
sure?
That's a challenge. I know a lot of Americans are facing right now too, for sure, in uncertain times.
Sure. It's definitely a challenge. And yet, again, being born where and when we have been, so much less of a challenge than it has been in the past. I mean, I don't remember if I wrote this in the book, but, when Zen came to China or to Japan, the Chinese teachers had to travel a hazardous voyage by caravan and then by ship to Japan, or the Japanese monks who were hungry for the teachings had to go to China and risk shipwreck and bandits and everything just to go to meet that one person. And today we can talk the way we're talking now, right? So
yes.
We have a lot, or we can hop on a plane and be someplace in a day, anywhere in the world. So we have a much easier situation now, but the book I really did write for people in that situation so that they could have some basic conceptual framework or foundation, and then a certain amount of practice that they can start to work with on their own. And there's a lot in there that people can start to work with until they do meet someone.
Yeah.
That being said, I don't think it's necessary to live near your teacher necessarily. If one is able to meet that person face to face, especially in a retreat situation, a couple times a year, that could be enough. And there were long periods of time where my main teacher, actually, he was an abbot of a temple in Hawaii, so we didn't see him that often, just during special retreats throughout the year. But it's still enough to go forward as long as you have that ongoing guidance and input to keep you on track. When we say that Zen can't be done alone, it just means that, as deluded people, we're the least qualified to guide ourselves. So we need someone else to kind of help us to see through our own stuff. But the real bulk of the work is still going to be done on one's own at home. So there's no real obstacle, no great barrier to it. If one can develop that relationship, even from a distance, check in from time to time, it could be enough. So I want to encourage people.
Yeah.
If they're interested to do that, they can try to do that.
Yeah. I that's wonderful advice, because I've always held that any teaching or practice has to work in all the situations I'm going to find myself in, whether I'm standing in line at the grocery store or in traffic or, comforting my children, or even having to defend something or a cause. It has to work in those things. And does it fall apart? I've always asked myself that, does this shatter whenever it's tested? And so, yeah, that makes a lot of sense to the way you're outputting that. I did find it fascinating, though, because you talked about being in the presence of a realized teacher and the energy of that. And so if you could talk a little bit about that, I thought that was kind of fascinating because, immediately coming from a Christian culture, I thought, oh, this must be very much what the disciples of Jesus must have felt like, or what they were getting from being in front of their teacher, like that this was a direct transference and the affinity to him in that relationship, how valuable that was.
And not even Christ, but even great saints. I think to meet someone like St. Francis, for example, there must have been a certain charisma, a certain energetic feeling around someone like that. So we recognize the same thing. And that's, again, one of the reasons why training with someone face-to-face in person is important, because you're not just learning a body of intellectual knowledge, you're learning a new way of mind-body functioning and a new way of seeing, a new way of experiencing your own intrinsic wisdom. And the knowledge of how to do that has to come from someone who's modeling it themselves or manifesting it themselves. You can catch that energetically from them. I often use the example, the same way that a vibrating guitar string can make an adjacent string vibrate. That's the kind of model of the transmission between the teacher and student. So when you meet great teachers, you could be changed just by their presence. And the students who carry on their teachings or become successors of those people, like the disciples of Christ, are transformed by that energetic field and come to embody that themselves, and so can maybe transmit it to the next generation. I don't think that's unique to Buddhism, that idea. We have a terminology for it and we acknowledge it and we talk about it a lot, but I think even when it's not so explicitly explained, most spiritual traditions can recognize that experience. Even doesn't have to be a spiritual tradition. Sometimes you meet someone who just has a certain quality about them that makes you feel great, and you feel transformed by being around them. A kind of vibration between humans we could recognize, right? So
yeah,
maybe Zen is one way to cultivate that.
I love what you said about the guitar string. That is actually beautiful. That's going to really stick with me or vibrate with me, so to speak. You're getting into one more really important thing that I noted that I wanted to talk about, and you've said it a few times, and all of them have been great segues, but you just mentioned St. Francis, and that kind of brings me kind of full circle to one of the things you talked about, which was using iconography or statues as a way to learn as well. And so I'll segue into that by saying, and why St. Francis is important. My time in Catholic culture, St. Francis was one of those icons really for me. And I remember, and I still carry a bunch of Catholic cards with me. As I was reading your book, I was like, oh, this is very similar to kind of this personal practice I have with these Catholic saints. I know they were just people. They were people just like you and I, but the iconography and the way they're standing and the item they may be holding or the way their hand is postured is a lesson into itself, and just meditating on those icons like that has been almost a teacher and an energy that comes from them. In a way, for me, sometimes I will practice, let's say I'll draw a St. Francis card. And so for that day, I will say, okay, today I will think of St. Francis and the way he's portrayed here without his shoes and his humble apparel, and learn from just the image itself. So anyway, I say all that to mean to get around to what you talked about in your book. That's a part of your practice as well, correct?
Oh, very much so. That's the power of sacred art, and that's the power of ritual, and that's the power of sacred places. A beautiful cathedral or church. You could have a feeling there which transform you just by entering the space. And the Catholic tradition I value so highly because it retains that understanding of how to use those things in the way that you described. Even the central ritual being Mass.
Yeah.
The moment that the host is elevated and the bell is rung, that traditional understanding is that's the moment that the energetic connection with God happens. It literally happens, not just conceptual or symbolic way.
Right.
We could believe that happens, yeah. And I believe that a powerful religious image or icon, you can catch something energetic from it that can transform you. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah. I had really, that's helped me a lot of times and probably saved me from myself. More times than I can count. I mean, even recently, I kind of was going through a time where I almost felt like I was picking up just residual stuff off of other people and just carrying it around on myself, and I didn't know what to do with it. It was really creating this charge, right? And that charge had nowhere to go. And one afternoon I was looking at this statue of the Buddha that I have, and he's touching the earth with his hand, and I'm going, all these years I just kind of never really stopped to think of just the value of flesh on the earth. And so I went to the park, found a quiet place, no one was out there, and I took my shoes off, sat on the ground and put my hands on the ground, and it was the most healing thing. And it was just such a simple, plain lesson that I've been walking right by this statue and recognizing, oh, that's the Buddha, not really looking at what he was doing. And on that particular day, it had value and as a lesson, an unspoken lesson.
Well, that right there is yogic practice. In other words, how can I use my body in particular ways to change how I experience? You could catch it from the Buddha statue, and many of the gestures we call them mudras. Many of the postures, the ways of sitting, the symbolism of the objects that are held, just as you mentioned with your cards. We can use all that stuff that way, but the point is, it has to go beyond just the conceptual content. When we let it come into the body and we actually physically use it, then the mind can change much more rapidly than if we try to change the mind using just the mind.
Yeah.
Our way is to use the body to change the mind.
Yeah, that's something that I definitely am going to take away from your book and just from this conversation, because I'm definitely guilty of thinking and conceptualizing. In fact, I remember when I was going through some Catholic training years ago, I almost was I've brought this up a few times on this show because I was almost a little sad. I mean, that's the only way to describe it. I was a little disappointed maybe because we were doing a lot of book learning, and I noticed that I was sitting in a chair, watch a video, read a book, and I was like, okay, I want to go do something. Like, I want to feel this. I don't just want to think about it. And so your book, to me, that was one of the big takeaways. I was like, okay, it's a holistic approach. It's not just conceptualizing awakening or having great perspectives on things. And that's all well and good, but it's also, I've got to feel this in my body. I need to make my body more a part of it, not just my brain and my skull, I guess, my thinking.
Well, that's why it's so great if you have a chance, or if anyone who has a Catholic background has a chance to go hang out with some of the contemplative orders. Go to Gethsemane in Kentucky, for example. Those people can show you what embodied spirituality is. No doubt.
You're talking my
and
language.
Even practices.
Merton,
practices like the Rosary, I think. Oh yeah. But even something like the Rosary, I think, is fantastic. You're using your body in a minimal way. You're holding the rosary, but you're also visualizing, you're reciting, praying. I mean, there are a lot of there's a richness of practice in the tradition that has that angle if you know where to see it.
Yeah. When you strip off like maybe the words associated with these things, you can look at them. I totally get that. I felt that many times when I was in Catholic culture, that I was seeing some, coming at it, having traditionally looked at things, I guess, from a Buddhist perspective, coming into Catholic culture was very interesting because you do see Zen, you do see these practices that are almost outside of being labeled to some degree. They are pure. And so without the calling it this or calling it that, you could transplant one for the other, Very, very, very similar things happening there. You're right. It's a beautiful thing. I do wish deeply that there was more of an awareness in my community like that. I think we'd have you'd see a lot more experiential awakenings, I guess, happening. I really think you would, because it's a little bit more like a tribe or a culture, I guess, where I live, if that makes any sense. I don't know. I'm not in maybe that that area where there's a monastery or a contemplative practice in any proximity. So I don't get to see it too often.
I'm happy, I know it.
This episode's Fishing for Goodies Fishbowl sponsor is Brimstone Museum and Henning Cultural Center in Sulphur, Louisiana. I don't know what you look for when you travel, but one of the things I look for when I'm putting together my itinerary is a unique museum or gallery in the city I'm traveling to. I do this almost every time I go to a new city, but if I'm being honest, I'm guilty of not always doing that very thing right here at home in Sulphur, Louisiana. That's really a shame, because we have one of the most interesting, historically relevant, and culturally rich corners in any city in the country about 2 minutes from where I'm sitting right now. I'm talking about the Brimstone Museum and Henning Cultural Center. Have you ever really thought about why our city is named Sulphur? They've got a permanent exhibit on the history of the sulfur industry that answers that simple question and more. You really get a full scope of just how important the sulfur mining industry was to the development of Southwest Louisiana and the impact it had on the rest of the world. Yes, the rest of the world. On the same property, right next door to the museum, is the Henning Cultural Center, presenting some of the most interesting, modern, and culturally relevant local art shows I've ever seen. My dear friend Tom Trahan and the Brimstone Historical Society have really worked hard to give us this treasure, and it's a multifaceted jewel that I plan to take advantage of more often. You don't have to wonder what their hours are, or how to get there, or what shows are coming up. Just go to brimstonemuseum.org like I did, and subscribe to their mailing list right there on the homepage. That's brimstonemuseum.org. Tom will make sure you start getting the announcements for each and every new show at the gallery. But you don't have to wait for the mail to arrive to enjoy this historical local treasure. You don't have to be guilty, like me, of overlooking a local wonder that conveniently sits next to the Grove, one of the most beautiful walking parks in Southwest Louisiana. Drop in and say hi to Tom for me. Tour the museum and center, and make sure to tell Tom that you heard about Brimstone Museum on Find the Good News. Now, let's take that dive in the fishbowl.
If you listen to the show, you'll see this fishbowl come out quite a bit, and what it is there's actually 400 questions in there. And so what we do with each guest is we draw 3 questions out, and then we discuss them at the end of the show.
All right.
So I've got
Let's see what the lottery brings me.
That's right. It's the question lottery. That's a good way to put it. They've always been relevant. I've always thought that was pretty fascinating. It's like a magic 8-ball that actually works. You know what I mean? Okay. Well, this is a nice, good, so this maybe will generate a great story. So this question is, have you ever given someone a handmade present?
Oh, yeah, quite often. One of the things that I enjoy doing as a craft, and I have training in, and I also use it to support the monastery, is I'm a metalworker. I do forging, particularly bladesmithing. Yeah, I forge knives primarily. And the stuff that I tend to like to make and that people seem to enjoy are kind of 18th and 19th century pattern outdoor knives. I have a lot of friends who are outdoorsmen, campers, hikers, even one gentleman who's fantastic, to my mind, the best wilderness survival instructor in the country is in Kentucky, a gentleman named Craig Caudle, Nature Reliance School.
Okay.
But I have gifted him knives that I make, and it's nice when you make something and you know it's going to be in someone's hand. Yeah. It's a connection to them.
I actually collect knives and use them. The ones I collect, that's so fascinating, man. I have a huge knife. I love knives. I mean, we have a small family here in our community. They all, the son, the father, and the mother, they all make handmade knives together, and beautiful experience to see them do it. It's like a combination of some modern techniques, but the father does more of the forging and stuff like that. But I had no idea that you did that.
We have an Etsy shop. It's called Bright Forest Forge.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, anyone can check it out. But it's a remarkable craft. I like it because it's very elemental. You've got fire, you have water, you have the steel, and of course your own energetic input of the hammering and so on. It goes along very well with Zen training, actually.
Man, I could have done a whole podcast about this. I had no idea. No, it's fascinating. You just spoke my language, man. I mean, like the fire, I'm all about that. You know, it's like exactly what you said, especially when you have a blade that somebody gave you. Those are special. I mean, like even like a hammer, like I have one of my father's hammers when he passed away.
Oh, yeah.
And it's the one that I always saw him use. He was a carpenter. And I mean, it's sitting right here about 5 feet from me on a block of wood. And it's tattered and torn, and the leather straps are all worn off. But I told somebody, I said, that hammer means nothing to anybody else. I said, but to me, it's like it came down from heaven, because when I know his hand was on it, and I know all the sweat and the times he bled on it, and the iron, it's just something about it. There's something very spiritual. I mean, it's like Excalibur, you know?
Yeah, his life is in it, and now you have it.
Yeah, well, I'm going to definitely check out your Etsy shop, and I encourage the listeners to do that too. That's a nice little side note. You can probably tell my whole tone changed. I got really excited about that. When we get off of our call today, I'm going to go check it out.
Yeah, I've got one. I know the video is not going to show on the podcast, but here's a knife right here.
Oh my gosh! So you made that? God, that's lovely, and I like that's a good hefty knife. I mean, I have smaller ones, but I like the big choppers, you know, that I can bring out and really put to work, you know, out in the woods.
Nice.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. This next question is great for a Zen abbot. Okay, it says, what activities make you lose track of time?
It's funny because in a way we're always on a schedule here. There's always something that's happening at a particular time, but you tend to. I lose track of days, actually. So something about living in a monastery, you start to go more by the light and also by the seasons than you do by the day of the week. So I guess I would have to say that Zen life has destroyed my concept of calendars.
That's wonderful, though, isn't it? I mean, that sounds... You just made me think of my wife. We used to get up at the same time every day. Our phone alarm would go off, and during the pandemic, whenever we had to stay home so much, we turned our alarms off, and so she woke up with the light, and the light comes up, you know, right into our bedroom window, and it's like this little hole in the blinds, and it makes this sort of beam that comes right onto the bed. And so that's how she wakes up now. And she said, oh, it's so much better just to let the light, you know, hit that part of our bed. And I wake up with the light instead of this synthetic bell, you know, or buzz or whatever tone.
Sure.
Yeah, that sounds awesome.
Yeah,
man.
For me, it's amazing. It's kind of a new thing and amazing, but, you know, we're in the middle of farm country here, surrounded by people who live that way their whole life, so it's not that unique.
Yeah. What you just said reminded me, speaking of Gethsemane, it reminds me of Thomas Merton. You know, he talks about that quite often, the sounds of the farms around his hermitage, you know, and that's very interesting. All right, so this is your last question. This one's a little heavier. Describe the last time you misjudged a situation and what you learned from it.
Last time I misjudged a situation and what I learned from it. I mean, what I have fresh in my mind is a close relationship that recently ended. And I think what I learned from that, as one does with friendships or other relationships that sometimes don't go well, is how much one's own projection is a layer up on top of the person, and how much we are reacting to that idea of the person rather than to the person in their own rights. And it's unfair to ourselves to do that. It's unfair to the person to do that. I never cease to be amazed, even with all the Zen training I've done, at the extent to which I fabricate my own reality and put it on top of people, put it on top of situations. It's always shocking to see the extent to which that is done, and in this particular case, quite shocking. Yeah, so
that is an honest
can't
answer.
Take it negatively. Yeah,
it is. I mean, I've done the same thing. I'm guilty as charged. I have, as I listen to you say that, I think of immediately of 2 or 3 people that I still continue to do that. I mean, I've put them in these containers on the shelf, and time goes by, and in my mind, they don't change. And so I treat them as if they're who they were when I know I'm not who I was, right? So, I mean, but I don't give them the same courtesy to some degree, and it's very difficult. It's a difficult thing.
In Christianity or Western traditions tend to talk in terms of forgiveness. Buddhism tends to talk more in terms of compassion.
Yeah.
And if we can remember to not lose that base compassion for the person, but also for oneself, for having made the errors that we each make, there's still a fruitful place within that to renew or form a new relationship, to build something new on the foundations of the old one. I like to never close that door.
Yeah, no, I'm with you.
That's the other side of it. Yeah.
Yeah, compassion is a treacherous road. It can be often painful. I mean, I believe in it and I want to be more compassionate, but I know that sometimes what I think is compassion. I think, in fact, I might have even posted something from your book about that, is getting the two things mixed up, where it's sentimentality and you think you're being compassionate because you feel you just feel sorry for somebody, or you go, well, that's sad for them. Compassion's so different than that, and I walk that tightrope too daily. Am I being compassionate, or am I just being sentimental? That's the work.
I have this image in my mind sometimes of sentimentality, or just kind of a base sympathy. Like the old frontier forts. I think of like Daniel Boone days or something. It's like you're behind the log palisade and you can look out and feel sorry for someone, but compassion is leaving the fort.
Yeah.
Stepping out into the wilderness and exposing yourself.
Yeah.
That's the real thing that takes courage.
Boy, that's a great way to put that. That's fantastic. That's a great takeaway too. I have one question left. It's not from the fishbowl. It's on the back of this yellow mug, which you probably can't see, but we'll send you one of these. It says on the front, it's got "Find the Good News." On the back, it's got a question. And it says, did anything good happen today? And I'll tell you just quickly why that's on there. When I started the show, I realized that sometimes just the way we say something change, just like we just said about people, just the way we ask a question can almost taint the question right from the gate. And so I noticed with my children, after they would get home from school, I would say, so how was your day? Or what happened today? And I would notice that we would all kind of gravitate towards the negative. Oh, my teacher gave us this homework, or, oh, this person called me this name, and so we'd spend a lot of time on these negative things. And so it occurred to me that what if I just changed the way I asked that question? What if I just said, did anything good happen today? And started off right there. All of us started looking for our blessings throughout the day instead of focusing on all the bad things. So I added it to the show, and said, hey, I'll ask each guest the same question.
That's a good question. Just about all of it. I woke up in a safe place, and I woke up to begin with.
Yeah.
And I'm relatively healthy, and I was able to walk downstairs where there was breakfast, and I had food, and I could spend time this morning doing spiritual practice, meditation. Paradise.
It's
paradise.
Sounds like paradise to me. Kyle, thank you for your time. Yeah. I really appreciate this conversation.
Oh, my pleasure.
So you have
a great time it was. Thanks so much.
I hope you enjoyed it too. So you have a new book coming out,
Very
right?
Much.
This year?
That's right. It comes out in October.
Yeah.
From Shambala Publications again. And the title is Hidden Zen: Practices for Sudden Realization and Embodied Awakening, or Sudden Awakening and Embodied Realization. Anyway, just look for Hidden Zen.
Yeah.
You'll find it. It's not so hidden. It's on the Shambhala site and Amazon already.
Excellent. Yeah, and your previous book, Rinzai Zen Way. Yeah, I've got it. I've got it on my Goodreads page for any of the listeners that follow me there. I've got that, and then I pre-ordered your new book, so I'm looking forward to reading that. Got to go check out your Etsy store for sure. I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. And for folks that want to support the monastery, you have a Patreon page, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we do. If you just search for Korinji, Korinji, you can find it on Patreon. Or if you go to the Korinji website, which is korinji.org, there's a button right there.
Okay. Excellent. Roshi, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate this.
I'm more thankful every moment that I found you.
Thanks for listening to my Beacon Series conversation with Meido Moore Roshi. If you'd like to experience his book, The Rinzai Zen Way, or support the Korinji Monastery, make sure to visit the links in the show notes. If you found something of use in this conversation, consider helping me spread the good news by supporting Find the Good News at patreon.com/findthegoodnews. I thank you for pressing play and for syncing up with this good news signal.